There is news from the Avdiivka region. The Russians continue to lose soldiers and equipment in the clashes in Avdiivka. After the bad results and losses in the northern region, the Russians organized operations in the south of Avdiivka, but failed here as well. Bad weather conditions are reducing the Russians' options on the front line. The Russians are unable to move heavy armored vehicles through the muddy roads to the front line. They fail in their operations with infantry and a small number of armored vehicles. Russian forces have recently renewed their operations on the northern flank of Avdiivka. The Russians launched a new attack attempt, but lost a large number of soldiers before they could expand their area of action. The Russians identified the Stepove region as the first target. We have stated in our previous reports that the Ukrainian army is constantly monitoring this area. Following the movements of the Russian army in Stepove and its outskirts, the Ukrainian army realized that the density of the Russians in the region increased. The Russian army knows that its attacks cannot damage the Ukrainian positions by destroying them. They are wearing down the Ukrainian positions with their attacks. After the Ukrainian army noticed the Russians concentrated in the region, it strengthened its defense blocks against the Russian attack in the region, analyzed the directions from which the Russians could come, and informed the artillery teams. The defense strategies and operations of the Ukrainian army are effective against the weakened Russian troops in the region. Ukrainian reconnaissance teams located Russian troops and informed the defense units. Ukrainian forces launched an offensive against the Russian troops positioned around the wrecked equipment and destroyed buildings in the region. Ukrainian troops hunted down the Russian troops before they started their counterattack operation. The Ukrainian army, which organized attack operations with kamikaze drones on the Russian positions detected in the region, chased and neutralized the Russian troops trying to escape. While the Ukrainian army continues to inflict losses on the Russians with its victories in the region, the military losses of the Russians have reached very high levels. The Ukrainian army also attacked around the railway station. Ukrainian forces knew that there was no place for the Russians to hide here, and that the area of movement in the region was very wide. Targeting the Russian soldiers here, the Ukrainian army created a complete killing zone here. Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles became the fearful dream of Russian soldiers in the region. Russians tried to escape from the drones but failed. While the Russian army continued to suffer losses at different points, other troops were ordered to attack Stepove. Instead of large groups of soldiers, the Russian army advanced towards Ukrainian positions with troops consisting of 10 or 20 soldiers. This strategy is quite wrong for the Russians at the moment. The Ukrainian army mostly knows where the Russians will attack and the direction of movement in the region. For this reason, intense and sudden attacks can have a more destructive effect on Ukrainian positions, but the Russians prefer to attack in small groups. This is both because the Russians are not strong enough to carry out this attack in the region, and because of the bad weather conditions in the region. Russian troops need both large numbers and heavy armored vehicles and tanks to overcome the entrenched and strong Ukrainian defenses in the region. Only in this way can it carry out devastating attacks. However, the Russian army is currently unable to send heavy armored vehicles to the region and is not sufficiently organized due to Ukrainian pressure in Kherson. Nor does it mean that the Russians will be able to win the war in the region if they arrive with very rough troop groups and heavily armored vehicles. The Russians may be more effective in this way, but the Russians have already tried this before and failed. The Russians suffered significant losses in their attack on the Stepove region. The weak and unbalanced offensive units of the Russian army were destroyed. However, the Russians continued their offensive operations in Avdiivka. They carried out another offensive operation south of Avdiivka. The Russian army has established control over some areas in the Avdiivka region. It continues to occupy the area, but what they have lost is too much for what they have gained. Russian soldiers and the Russian people do not think it makes sense to lose so many soldiers and equipment. Russian soldiers who do not want to fight, Russian soldiers surrendering to Ukrainian troops on the front line explain the situation to us. The Russian people are also reacting to Russian leader Vladimir Putin because of the losses on the front line. Do you think the Russian people are right to react to Putin? Do you think it makes sense for Vladimir Putin to continue the attacks by sending more troops to the front line, ignoring the losses? The Russians carried out an offensive operation against the Ukrainian defense blocks north of the chemical plant south of Avdiivka. The Russian army was not as effective here as it wanted, and the Ukrainian army managed to prevent the Russian attacks. The positions of the Ukrainian army in this region are at a difficult point for the Russians to reach. For this reason, the Ukrainian army has advantages over the Russian troops who carried out the attack. However, the Ukrainian army is counterattacking after repelling the attacks of Russian troops attacking with uncrowded troops. The Ukrainian army, which tried this strategy in some regions, was successful. Ukrainian forces announced that 5 Russian soldiers were killed in and around Russian positions during the counterattack south of Avdiivka. The Russian army had previously failed around the chemical plant and north of Avdiivka. The Russian army's attacks were not intended to capture the area completely, but to observe the conditions again and to wear down the Ukrainian defenses in the area. If the Russians had been able to advance in this area, they would have continued to reinforce the offensive with reinforcements, but they failed to do so. The majority of the troops sent to the region did not return. According to the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, General Valery Zaluzny, in the month when the enemy became more active near Avdiivka, the Russian army lost about 10,000 soldiers in this direction. Recently, the spokesperson for the Unified Press Center of the Defense Forces in the Tauria direction, Stepove, reported that, in the Avdiivka area, Russian forces advanced several mechanized columns with armored vehicles. However, the offensive failed and the occupiers lost almost 80% of their equipment. The industrial zone southeast of Avdiivka is the first line of defense of the Ukrainian garrison. The city and the industrial site are separated by a suburban area, which is now in the gray zone. To begin street fighting in Avdiivka itself, the Russians have to overcome an open field and wade through vast minefields under relentless Ukrainian artillery fire. Both sides have enough reserves to continue the Battle of Avdiivka for a long time. Despite heavy casualties, there are no signs that the Russian military command is ready to abandon its attempts to encircle the Ukrainian stronghold and redirect its efforts to other, more strategically significant parts of the front. Although the Ukrainian army continues to defend Avdiivka, Avdiivka is no longer a place where people can live. Avdiivka has become a ghost town of rubble. After intense shelling and clashes, the buildings in the area were completely destroyed. Once a city of 32,000 people, Avdiivka has become a post-apocalyptical pile of rubble after Russia launched an all-out war against Ukraine. Most residents had already left the city fleeing indiscriminate Russian shelling. Only 1,336 civilians stay in the besieged ghost town that the Russian army continues to destroy with airstrikes and artillery fire. According to Alexander Stepove, spokesman for the Ukrainian Army's Tauria Operational Forces Group, Russia deployed up to 40,000 troops to the Avdiivka region in October. Based on these numbers, we could say that Avdiivka was under Russian control, but the Russians failed to do so. The Ukrainian Army's defense strategies and strong operations prevented the Russians. Do you think the Ukrainian Army will be able to completely repel the Russians from Avdiivka? Although critical supply routes in the region are under Ukrainian control, Avdiivka is besieged by the Russians and Putin seems to continue to do so. Do you think the Ukrainian army has a chance in Avdiivka?